Alright, hello everyone. This is Shmarl here. I'm the creator of RWBY Fangame, and as promised, I wanted to give you guys a little back scenes tour of how the game functions, and give a little overview of how development on Clickteam Fusion is going, and maybe you can kind of see why I do certain things a certain way. So let's give you a brief overview. So with Fusion, everything's based off of a concept called scenes, and these scenes can either be things like levels, they can be menus, they can be whatever you want it to be. And one of the things that I personally wanted to do with this particular project, instead of some older projects, was to try to streamline this and make the code as modular as possible, so that way I didn't have to rewrite the same code over and over, and if I had to go back and make a change, like a balance change, I wouldn't have to do it in 100 different scenes. So actually, most of the entire game is in this one scene here, the entire battle mode of the game. And then the entire visual novel is in this one scene. And then I mostly use some of these other scenes for more menu and UI, such as like the partner select screen, let's get back to here. Of course, the main menu, disclaimer, and these could possibly all group together as well, but I decided to keep them separate, just make things simple. This is where I have the enemy information control set up. It's this screen here. The only time that I didn't really follow this is with the map UIs. So I have a specific one for Patch, which is Chapter 1, and I have a separate one for Forever Fall, and they'll be all separated. And I could combine these if I wanted to, but it would require a few more variables, but I kind of figured that with the complexity it is, and we'll go into this another time, on exactly how, if you play the game, areas unlock and show up on the map, that particular complexity might be more problematic trying to group that together. So I just kind of keep it simple and keep it segregated. But everything else is pretty combined. So if you want to see, this is actually what the battle mode looks like, this awful mess of objects, and it gets even more complicated when I hide another unhide UI. Like this is the equip menu, and then the area cleared menu. The other UI elements is just, I have one specifically for this menu bar down here, so that way nothing overlaps it. And then of course the game mode here. Now in terms of code, Fusion has a very interesting way of doing its code, where it reminds me of like an Excel spreadsheet. Let's see here, let me scroll this over. So basically everything in Fusion is based on what's a concept of an event. So how an event works, as in the case here, like this is start a frame. You have events such as like if this object touches this object, if you have other events like on key press, mouse press, if variable A equals this, if timer equals this. All those events go on the left-hand side, going vertically here. In case you're wondering, these little grayed out sections, this is disabled code, so this is kind of code that I'm not using anymore, but I don't really want to get rid of it, probably because I might use it in the future. But these dark ones here, so you see like here, this is a counter object, so if wave count equals 16, and the cutscene. So cutscene is a variable I created attached to Ruby, which is supposed to tell the machine to stop player input and play a video. Back in the early days of the game, there was supposed to be some animations that were done with using the in-game sprites, but that became too problematic, so I moved to the visual novel. So that's not really used for that. Instead, cutscene variable now represents if you have like the UI elements, so like the equip menu open in game, that pauses the game. So that's what it's being used for, but so it's still valid. And as you see on the top bar here, this is a list of all my objects. So you have your event, and then when this event triggers, then you go to each object and then you list an action. So in here, this is the create object. I can create, here I'm creating an instance of Neo and instead of Roman. I know it's kind of hard to see, but that's what's going on here. Tell what layer to put them on and what position to put them. And if I scroll over to the Neo and Roman objects, I set variables tell them their current layer property, set their health, and their AI action. We'll have to go into the AI actions and all these nifty little things I coded in for them later, but this is just a general overview. I also set wave count. So battle mode includes both the arcade mode and the story mode. Arcade mode works differently than story mode, where you just there's no video elements, there's literally just a list, and that's what you're looking at here. That's what this wave count object is for, specifically for arcade mode. How it works is whenever it detects there's no enemies on the screen, it looks up what the current wave count is. It then ups the wave count by 1, and then it executes the code down here, equivalent to the one that it currently is set to. So 11 here, this one, what does this guy create? This one creates a Balrog. And as you go down the list, and you see it's quite extensive, the enemies list gets bigger and bigger. We have some Lancers, we have some White Fang, we got a bunch of Alpha Beowulfs and small Nevermores, and it goes further and further down the list. And you can, using other events, we can actually split up, and there's in some cases where, particularly for boss battles, I can actually set that because in arcade mode you can play with any of Weiss, Blake, or Yang, or you can play with just RWBY, and I adjust some of the boss fights in case you are just playing with RWBY to make them a little bit easier, as they can be quite difficult, and make it more difficult having a secondary partner. So that's what's going on here. Let's go back up here. So with having everything in one scene, it can get kind of messy, so I'm going to try my best to explain what's going on here. So in story mode, unlike arcade mode, there's a typical flow of data going between different sources. So when you start in story mode, you go straight from the main menu, and then from the main menu, there's actually two global variables. There is called current position and max position. And that's basically what max position is what tells it as far in the story as you've gotten. So every single event in the story, every single place you visit, has a number attached to it. So you start off at 0, which is the intro video, and then you go 1, which is that initial scene in front of Summer's grave, and then it works up from there on out. So I think the last one on the list is 27, which is that final battle with the Deathstalker and the end of chapter 2. So we have that, and then we have the current position, which basically tells where you currently are. As you recall, in the overworld maps, it memorizes what your last event you've done. So if you go back and replay them, let's say like I've already completed chapter 2, but I go back to chapter 1 to go visit the store for some reason, or want to replay, like, let's say, the bridge battle, I can do that, and it memorizes where you currently are, and will respawn RWBY back at the bridge when you return to that position. It does not, when you jump back to another chapter, then it places you back at the starting point back here, but you can easily jump back to where you were. That's not an issue. But that's what the current position is for. So the general flow is, whenever you're in one of these maps, you select one of these events, you go there, it sets your current position to that number of event. So I think this is 11, if I remember right. So if I go to the airport, it'll set it to 11, then you see RWBY walk over there, and then it detects that when it's 11 and you're overlapping with that, then it would immediately take you to the visual novel, no matter what event. And I know there's some events in the story that don't actually have a story attached to it, they just go straight into battle, but even though they do that, they all have to go through here. So they go through here, which is a visual novel, and then it looks up that number, that event number, which is the current location, and then uncomments out, it activates the code that's in here. And these are basically the steps that make the visual novel, or the dialogue sequence. It goes in here, and which each step I basically I usually create all the characters from the start, but I can just change their animation position, their positions, their exact dialogue. So I have a dialogue object here, And oh, this is a lot. This is all the dialogue I have so far in the game. But as you see, they're assigned a number, so I just look up the number per frame. I can show and hide the UI element, which is where the dialog box. That's why there's certain times where it goes away and sometimes it doesn't. And they all channel through here. So for example, for one that doesn't actually have, which is the Northern Forest, the only code that it has in here is just on group activation, which is the event. Of course, I set who you have access to here. Then just come straight to frame loading. So basically, this is just an intermediate point. And honestly, I do that specifically, one, because 90% will have an event. The rare ones that don't, it's going to be like a half a second of just darkness. It's not that big of a deal, but it's a lot of code that could possibly break if I would have to tell it, try to figure out, do you want to jump straight to loading, or if you want to jump straight to here. So I figured everything just channels through here, make it simple. So once you go through your visual novel section, and this works for basically everything except for the shop sequences, but they all just go straight down the list. You hit shift, you hit or any of the action keys, and it just takes you to the next step. And then when you hit the last step on the list, then it would activate. Oh, this, of course, I opened up a shop. I meant to open up this one. Or if you hit escape, which is your kind of exit, you basically stop any samples playing, and then you jump to either the map. So this is an ending. There's an opening event and an ending event. So the bridge has two parts. You have the event where she shows up and she speaks to the fisherman. Then the Grim attacks, and then it takes you to battle mode. So here on step 10, jumping to frame loading. Loading is only used for battle mode, so that's how it's automatically just set to go from loading to battle. So all I have to do is tell it to go to frame loading and load the battle mode. Let's see here. And then when battle mode is completed and you win, it'll take you back. It'll actually up the event one more. So event 5 in this case would be the ending of the bridge, and then it'll just jump straight back into here. And after you go through that ending dialogue, when you get the grappling hook and everything, then it'll take you back to the patch map. So from here, you'll go into loading. Loading is really just a very simple, you can't see it in the front here, but you'll see it in the game where there's a little tip thing, and all this code here basically does is it just randomizes and picks tip. There's some tips in here which is based on dynamic data, such as your control buttons, like your assignment, and that's why I have these little for particular instances. So if it's numbers, so it's a random value. So our first random, there's 16, it starts at 0. So in this case, I randomized 15, and that's the one that I display. And in these certain cases, like event 0, in value 0, 3, 5, I have to dynamically update the code here. As you see here, I'm pulling in this control X object is what allows me to create button assignments and basically look up what I have saved for that button assignment and it shows. So when you go in, and it's supposed to be like, well, when performing a 5th light attack, so that was normally the H button, but if you set it to the B button, it will show B. And then we go into battle mode, look up the code here, it'll go down into the story mode, go down into, I have it divided by chapters, but that's really just for organization purposes. It'll go into location 4, which is where the bridge battle with those weird slug grim. We'll set the reward for the mission. We'll activate the group, which is, if there's a tutorial, I have a little tutorial section. This one does have a small tutorial. And it works like the dialogue. You go in, you hit enter, it ups the counter, which then displays the next line in the tutorial. And then when you hit the end, you just hit enter and it takes you, closes this out, and it opens the actual code. And this is similar to how it's done with arcade mode. You have your wave counts, except this time it runs it once. So unlike arcade mode, you can only have that wave appear once. And then you basically go through in here. It's every time you wipe the floor, then it ups the count, starts the next wave. You run out of waves, then it activates the battle results, So it pops up that little victory screen. You get your reward money, and then it sends you back down to the whatever map you were previously doing. So in this case, patch map. If that makes any sense. So I'm kind of really generalizing it. It was a lot of code to get this up and running, and I don't know how much in depth you want to go, especially this is probably not just maybe hard for people not coding, but even if you did code, since Fusion is very unique in how it's presented, you may want to just jump in and do some basic tutorials on Fusion just to see how a lot of this works, and it might make a little more sense. And I can probably get into the nitty-gritty if you really want to see how things work, because aside from the battle mode code, it's only for code specifically to the battle, but it doesn't actually contain any of the code for or any of the AI code for them. That stuff, like for Ruby's control or Weiss's AI, all that is in her own set of code, this is called the object-based. We have 3 levels of code. You have what's called global code, you have what's called scene code, and then you have what's called object. So this is code that's so specifically for Weiss. And just to keep things clean, I decided to go this route. In my other games, I've usually included it into the scene. So scene code only runs on that scene, which is what I wanted to get away from this time around, because normally what would have to happen is I would have to make one scene, copy it, make a new level, and then any enemies I'll have to code directly in there, which can get quite daunting, especially with the large amount of enemies that I have in the game. So I did not want to do that. And instead of me, since everything's all compiled into one, I didn't want to have this endless list of thousands of lines of code. So this just helps modularize it. So anything related to Weiss will go into this here. A quick rundown of how their AI, how Weiss, and Weiss, Yang, and Blake is basically the same AI. It's just I change up exactly what the AI can do and what it pays attention to. But they all function basically the same, where they have this variable called NPC action. And it's basically a number. Technically it goes from 0 to 9999. I don't really use all those values. But that basically tracks its current state. So that way the AI can be fully aware of what it's trying to do in that moment. NPC action 9999 is their KO. So this is what happened here. These actions is, if the NPC action is 999, you play the animation that associates with it. So this one is fall, which is their KO animation. NPC action 99 is their getting back up, whether they get up on their own or Ruby helps them up. And then other ones, like common ones like NPC action 1 is their walking. 2 is usually like a light attack. 3 is another light attack. And it kind of goes from there. And you can see like heavy attack 1, dash, throw, etc., etc. So when it comes to the AI, all I need to do is to track basically an if statement of, let's say, if enemy is X distance, set her NPC action to 1, and then she has another variable for her direction, which is either 0 or 1, left or right. Set to appropriate direction based on if the position of the enemy is greater or less than her position, and then just set it to 1, and it knows. I have code later on that basically if the variable is 1, then she'll walk. She'll physically, like, I'll subtract or add her position depending on her current direction value. The other part of her AI here is there's an NPC target. In earlier versions of the game, it was visible. I'd like to think I hit it in later versions. I honestly don't remember if I did or not. But if you're ever curious to see how the AI was working under the hood, you can always load an older version of the game, and you can see the target, and you can see exactly what enemy the AI is paying attention to, what it's trying to do. That's basically how I really detect distances, because Fusion can handle things like loops, but they're, to me, a little backwards in terms of how, like, because I normally work with JavaScript and PHP, and I'm used to loops working a certain way, and they don't really work that way in Fusion, so I can understand it, but it's counterintuitive to me, so I just avoid them. So me having this target option, Weiss only has one enemy to keep track of, which makes the code a lot easier to run. That's why I have that here. So now the actual AI, it's just a whole lot of if statements depending on the position of the target, position of her. If it's too far, walk towards it. If the enemy is doing certain actions, if she's doing certain actions, you set the AI action. Like I have a whole list here of when animations are done, set her back to 0, 0, so her baseline default standing still animation. I'm trying to see where I can. As you know, Weiss has a lot, so I also do there's a lot of if statements that are basically the same, like similar code, but what they do is I use a random variable to decide whether she uses fire dust or she uses ice dust, or she decides to just dash to them. That's all controlled by another randomized variable. Movement is basically exactly where the code is to physically move Weiss across the screen. As you see, there's more than just walking. You have her walking ones, so basically just set position to her position -8, set to her position +8, depending which her direction is. But there's also other ones where, like, her dashes, and by dashes is the one where she uses her glyphs to thrust herself forward. That moves her, and you can see here I have those in here. There's some of them too where it's like her dashes. She can't, not to move every single frame, but specifically for X frames. So like the dash attack starts with her standing horizontally on a glyph. I don't want her moving for that part, so I'll have it here where it checks the frame. If it's greater than or less than a certain value, you move it, and then stops moving once it surpasses that. Some more animation stuff. Okay, so this is for Weiss has some special attacks with dust. She has her standard, she can like launch dust from Mercanzer, but she also has this like a stronger version where she can either launch like a giant blade of fire, she can have thunderbolts rain from the sky, or she can slam Mercanzer down and it spreads out ice on either direction. And those are handled here because these are all based on exact frames. When it's this frame of the animation, such as the lightning one, it launches several bolts. So when it's the specific frame, in this case 5, it'll spawn 2 glyphs and 2 thunderbolts. When it's frame 9, there's 2 glyphs, 2 thunderbolts at a different position. That's generally how that works. General is just generalized things that control like her aura regeneration. Basically, if she's not KO'd, her aura goes up depending on how much energy points she has. And it's just a different threshold. There's 3 levels, so at max energy, she regains 3 every 2 seconds, and then at minimum, she regains 1. I also control this heat thing is going to come up when I'm going to have a dedicated one to the enemies, and that's where I'll get into heat. But basically, heat is how I determine when you get not KO'd, but you can get knocked down. And I also use this for the enemies to have them get like a little stunned or staggered animations. That's what heat is. So basically, you have a counter similar to your health, but it actually counts up, and then once it hits a certain threshold, and for all of Team RWBY, it's going to be 100. For the enemies, it varies, but when that point is hit, then they'll either get knocked over, and then you have to waste frames getting back up, which means the enemy can get free hits on you, and in the case of enemies, they'll get staggered. But I'll get more into that when we go over the enemies. The revive and rescues, these were pain in my butt, but basically this is the code for Weiss rescuing RWBY when she gets knocked out and vice versa. As you see, it's here. And this has kind of been a long-standing thing that I'm going to slowly have to work on removing, but because the game was initially built specifically RWBY was the only planned character, all the core mechanics of the game is built into RWBY's logic. Hence why I have a section of code where just help RWBY specifically. There's literally no code in there. It's not possible to have Weiss and Yang in one match. So, but if there was, there's no code in there for specifically help yang, so I have to work on branching this off. But here's basically how it works is when it detects when Ruby's out, not cold. So when she has her aura equals 0, then she'll go into a state of regeneration where aura starts going up, but it doesn't actually, you don't visually see it in what's happening in the game. It's kind of like a secondary aura. So it goes into a negative value and it slowly climbs up, and then once it hits a positive value, then Ruby can get back up from a KO position. And that does go up over time, but most commonly what ends up happening is that if Ruby's aura is below 0, but Weiss's is above a certain threshold, and I think it's 20, so that way she doesn't go charging into her own death, so she'll have a little bit of buffer if she just takes hits trying to rescue Ruby, but basically it forces her target to go directly on Ruby, so she'll start walking towards Ruby, and then when she overlaps, then it will switch her AI action to whichever one I have set to initiate that little animation of help her up. And that basically every few seconds will increase that recharge time for Ruby. And then Ruby will get up when she hits 100. Or when it hits a positive value. Similar thing works vice versa, except I don't have to, of course, include logic for Ruby to run over since that's 100% controlled by the player. And get out isn't used for anything. I don't know what I was planning on doing with that. So in the future, I'm going to be slowly reworking this code where it's not necessarily, it's just going to be looking for the current aura value in the counter itself, not necessarily Ruby's aura. And by counter, I'm talking about this UI here. This UI is basically set to every single frame to reference Ruby's aura. This one references whoever is the active partner character. So in this case would be, if Weiss is active, you have Weiss. If not, it will just be blank. Currently, Weiss is referencing Ruby's auras directly. In the future, I'm going to have a reference this counter. So that way, if I do have the ability to play as a different combination of characters, it will reference their proper one. Okay, now this is a lot of information. Let's see what else I can kind of go over. Saving, let me quickly go over that. That was a little fun. So, saving actually took the longest, more than anything else, for me to get working. It's basic control, but it's INI object over here. And yes, there is some hidden INI object hidden somewhere in your registry where your save data goes into. And I had to kind of get smart with how because basically it just simply works. Let me show you the code. When you load, you basically just inserting it into a file, a specific value. And when you load it, you're just loading those files and putting it back into the associated variables in the game. That's simple enough, but since the entire game is 100% autosave, it got a little dicey as to the timing of which. So the game loads from the data directly from this screen, which is, I have to legally show it anyways. But this is how I basically set everything in the main menu. So everything here loads. So that includes story data, your control data, your what other things it would save and load? Money, all that other stuff loads in here. And then it goes into the main menu, so you have everything set here. And that's usually how you see the chapters populate, and it knows what to do there. There's nothing in terms of saving or loading in here, even though you think there is. In the latest version, I added the ability to, quote-unquote, delete your progress and restart from start, but it actually doesn't do any of that here. What it does is it basically forces your max value to 0 and jumps straight into the visual novel, which then triggers that initial cutscene that started at the beginning of the game. And when that completes, it'll jump into the patch map, and here's where I control saving. So I control it here, and I also control it in 2 more places. This controls saving. Obviously, if you set your you set your controls here, you want to save it, so that's where that happens. But in the maps, it does this is where this actual saving part happens. Let's see here. Menu. Where do I have it? Save. Simply the exact same thing, just putting it in the opposite direction. So saving is basically taking your variables and putting them in the file. So what ends up happening when you erase your data, and I just air quoted and you can't see me. When you erase your data, it'll take you back. It forces your max position to 0. It takes you to that initial cut screen, which then takes you here. And then, typically speaking, the game does not save on when your max position is less than 1, which it would be just 1 because this will be for Summer's Grave. But when you complete Summer's Grave, then it would actually save your position, and that's when it resets everything. I had to do it that way because otherwise I had a hell of a nightmare trying to test this game. Every single time I would forget, because I had the option to run the game, compile the game directly from the frame or from the whole application, and I kept running into issues where I actually hit run frame and I'll just wipe all my data, and I'm like, great, I have to now play the whole game, get back up to my what I'm currently testing, which took forever. So yeah, so technically your game doesn't actually get overwritten until after you complete the first event. So when you get to the forest, that's when it saves, and that's when it actually resets the data. The other point it does save is game over, because otherwise I want to restore where you were. So obviously you play, you lose, you had used all sorts of dust, all sorts of potions up to this point. Without having a load function here, you would basically be starting from scratch again. But this one is a partial load. It only loads specifically your status of how many potions and your dust. Everything else is left the same, so that way you don't mess up your data. It also helps with... it does not load anything specifically if you get game over on arcade mode, because arcade mode doesn't actually use any of your stored data. When you start arcade mode, you start with a fresh slate in terms of your dust and your potions. You always start with the X amount. You do get to keep your progress with your equipment, your modules for Crescent Roads. And that's all in, not a lot of code, but that's all in here. Simple enough. Yeah, current location 9999. Location 9999 is arcade mode. And see here, so I guess I load everything, but then I override it again with the default values. Okay, I think I'll stop this video here, and then I'll make a video specifically on the Grim and the enemies, and you can get to see a little bit more of the AI functionality. Alright, well, thank you so much for watching. Take care. Bye.